And and we're going to do meta-reality today. Now, I expect many of you know that critical realism is said to go through 3 stages. The first is basic critical realism. The second is dialectical critical realism, and particularly the 4 stages of meld. And the third stage is meta-reality. Now, we are only aiming to give you an introduction, a taste of all these different kinds of critical realism. Please don't feel that you have to do all of them. We leave you to decide which are the most useful for your work, particularly starting with basic though. And some people are very keen on meta-reality and some people are not. So we'll perhaps explore that this evening. Now we're going to start first of all with Rob, talking about his how meta-reality has helped his research. And just to remind you that Rob, the co-presenter of this course, was not that long ago a PhD student, attending the course as a student and contributing. And then he finished his PhD, he wrote the book of his PhD, and he was also managed to get a paid work at UCL IOE. So I hope a lot of you think, well, Rob can do it, so maybe I can too.
Yeah, I'm an idiot.
Right, so over to you, Rob.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, so just on that, so I was doing my PhD and attended the reading group a few years ago, and since have spent a couple of years at SOAS and then I'm back at UCL. So the life of a jobbing academic is slightly stressful, worrying about where the next job's coming from. But so far so good. They do appear if you keep plugging away. So keep plugging away. So thanks very much, Priscilla. So I'm going to talk for 25 minutes or so. I'll try and keep it as quick as possible to give us enough time to discuss later about meta-reality. So just a very quick recap. Can you see my shared screen?
We can see the opening slide. Okay. Yes.
Okay. So,
great. Yes, it's working.
Okay. So this is Roy Bhaskar when he was much younger, and just a quick reminder of where critical realism comes from. So I think this is helpful for just recapping where we come from. So Roy Bhaskar, when he'd finished studying PPE at Oxford, he went on to do a PhD and found that the theorizations that people were going through within economics or within philosophy were all well and good, but they didn't seem to have much impact on the people in the developing world that he was looking at, or that he was hoping to help. And he was serious about helping. So that's where critical realism comes from. He had to start making this distinction between the empirical, the actual, and the real, to recognize how one was going to affect change in the world. So we've talked so far about, I've got this picture of a conical flask because we talked about open and closed systems quite a bit at the start. So a chemist, for example, does their experiments in a conical flask in a test tube because they're trying to create a closed system where they can carry out their experiments. Now, obviously, as social scientists, we're working with open systems. There are any number of different generative mechanisms working on whatever we're looking at. And we need to be aware of those so that we can start theorizing the reality, those real generative mechanisms that we're looking at. So we've talked about going through this list. We talked about Bhaskar doing PPE at Oxford, open and closed systems. And this is where we come to the ideas of the real, the actual, empirical that we've talked about. And in fact, I'm going to skip over those second 2 bullet points because those are specific to my interests, which is in discourse. But Bhaskar latterly showed some interest in discourse, but well, I've talked about that previously. But we've then got these further developments of critical realism. And the further developments are the first one is in dialectical critical realism. And Priscilla talked to us about MELD, which is this schema for well, I suppose a schema for discovery, for methodology and approach to social sciences. And we talked about structure and agency, which was the the TMSA stands for the Transformation Model of Social Activity, and what that was the diagram that had two arrows going across in the same direction. One was for structure, one was for agency, and that is within dialectic. That's this classic dialectic, which shows how people's agency affects the structure of society then affects agency, and so on. And that is a dialectic relationship, those two things working together. And Pascal's book on dialectic, the subtitle is Dialectic, the Pulse of Freedom. So the idea is that from that dialectic, there is a moment of human and also global emancipation that occurs through the dialectic process. We then get on to, Pascal then talks about the philosophy of meta-reality. And this is where, I mean, many critical realists don't talk much about meta-reality because it's very much the third development of critical realism. And because I came to critical realism quite late, I don't really see three different phases of critical realism. I actually see it as always one of the same thing because they all work in harmony together. And I think people who perhaps have been working with critical realism over the last couple of decades, as these ideas have developed, see these distinct phases. So the third phase, if we are to perceive it as a phase, is the philosophy of materiality. And there are two books I want to raise. There's the obvious one, which is the philosophy of materiality. But there's another one, which is a really great book that I've got a lot from, which is, again, by Pascal, From Science to Emancipation. And there's lots of things towards the back of that book where there are lots of there are interviews and other lectures that he's given, which I found very helpful. So I'm going to talk to you today about the philosophy of materiality, or sometimes referred to as transcendental critical realism. And MELD, as you'll notice, this is a continuation of MELD. There are three more stages of MELD. Don't worry too much about this. I'll get to it that's going to be the final thing that I'm going to talk about. And I'm not sure why I've got concrete utopias there, but maybe we'll touch on them a bit later. So the first thing to say is talk about these specific developments in critical realism. And to conceptualize materiality, I think we have to just go back a little bit and talk about, the first is demi-reality. So demi-reality, living in the world that we live in now, which is not we don't live in a utopia. We live in a world that's governed by power relations, it's governed by economic relations, and you might describe these as master-slave relations. So all of our relationships, or many of our relationships, to exist as a master-slave dynamic. Someone is imposing their power over someone else, and someone else is having to do someone else's bidding, or being forced to do something else by someone. And in many ways, the world that we live in generally is a demi-real world. So the struggle is to try and to raise ourselves beyond that into something else. So dialectical critical realism, I spoke about that, dialectic, gets us some way beyond that by imagining and theorizing this duality. So we talked about structure and agency, and the duality of other things, which is essentially that you're starting to define things by what they are not. So that is, in very basic terms, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about duality. Meta-reality is the next phase of understanding, or a deeper phase of way of understanding the world, which is to understand that the world exists beyond that duality, and that there is a singular meta-real force in the world. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this. So if you just bear with me while I talk through this. So the first one is to think about meta-reality, your own experience of meta-reality. I'm going to give you a few examples of your own experience of meta-reality, but the classic one is as written here on one of the penultimate quote here, is the eureka or the aha moment. So all of you are academics, so you've all spent a huge amount of time of your lives, or at least the last few years, reading. You've been doing lots of reading, lots of research. And I would hazard that when you have come up with great ideas, you've come up with an idea that is perhaps unique, an idea that's got you excited, something that you thought, actually, this is something to work with here. It probably hasn't come while you've been reading those texts. It perhaps comes while you're sitting in the bath. It perhaps comes while you're in the shower, while you're going for a walk, while you're out for a run. I find often I get ideas. But it comes in a moment when you're not thinking about the thing that you're the idea that you're kind of trying to develop. So what happened there was that you came up with an idea while not thinking. So it was beyond your thinking, an idea emerged. So this is the first example of materiality. So there is a version of you that you do not know intimately, but who is constantly there. And that version of you is an expression of meta-reality. So I have theorized the existence of that meta-reality. So again, this is a critical realist process. I've theorized the existence of that meta-reality from my own experience, and perhaps from your experience if you've had that experience. So, and again, the eureka moment, classically, Archimedes was sitting in the bath when he came up with his ideas, before then being, sadly, he was then killed by a Roman soldier, wasn't he? Moving on, and I'm going to give you a few more examples of meta-reality, or examples of transcendentalism. So the first is transcendental identification in consciousness. And please, Gary, pick me up on all these, because Gary really is the expert on this. So hopefully he'll qualify anything that's unclear or whatever. So transcendental identification in consciousness is when you speak to someone. So as I'm speaking to you now, in the moment of you hearing me, listening to me, we are one. You're not thinking about me, you're not thinking about what I'm saying. You are accepting, and you are just consciousness. There is a breakdown in the gap between the two of us, and we become one in that moment of, again, and it's again a moment of unthinking. We're not thinking about it, you just are. The next one is transcendental agency. So transcendental agency. So the example here that I'm going to use is tying your shoelaces. Probably everyone has had a moment of where they've rushed, put their shoes on, tied their shoelaces, gone out the door, and as they're walking out the door, you realize that you can't remember having tied your shoelaces, yet your shoelaces are tied. So you have all these things that you can do on, you might call it autopilot. Another thing that people have experienced maybe is you may have walked or driven to work, and you get to work and you can't remember that you did it, because you had a form of agency that was within the realm of the transcendental. It was beyond your experience. You were still doing something, but beyond your experience. So it was unthought. Another example, this is in a crowd, transcendental holism. So if you're walking down a busy street, which actually is something that's relatively rare these days, I guess, but if you're walking down a busy street, you will navigate through the crowd, through thousands of people, without bumping into people. And as I was thinking about this the other day, I was thinking, does that always work? And I remember once I was walking down Oxford Street and I walked straight into someone. We totally collided, and it was so out of the ordinary that it was incredibly shocking. No one got hurt, but it was very shocking that we did it. So generally, we do manage to navigate past each other. In fact, when you start thinking about what you're doing, it's only when you start thinking that you start doing that shuffle where you both step in the same way, and you step the same way, and you step the same way, and you can't get past each other. When you're not thinking about it, you don't do that. We get past each other. And the other examples that we can use of this are a football team when they're in, so you might use the term words in flow, when they're working together, two people who are cooking together who know each other very well. Without thinking, you move around each other. Or also an orchestra, which is able to work together as one for something to emerge that is beyond all of those individuals. And the final one is Transcendental Self. So this is I'm going to put Mind here, which is a mental health charity, because this is sometimes talked about in terms of when people are experiencing mental health problems. If you, example of this is even if someone, and Roy Baskar writes about this in one of his books, is that even if someone is experiencing a psychosis and they're hearing different voices, the moment about which they might be able to heal is to ask the question, who is hearing those voices? And it is you, of course, that is hearing those voices. So there is still this, even when self is split, there is still a singular, what we would call a meta-real self at the base of that. And I'm just going to use to give you a final example, which is, some of you might recognize this symbol. This is the Om symbol, which is used in various sort of Eastern, non-Western religions, so in Hinduism and Buddhism. And the reason I bring this up is that a lot of Roy Bhaskakar's work on the transcendental, particularly when you read From Science to Emancipation, comes from him engaging with non-Western philosophies. And I'm putting the Om in place because from my own experience, my wife's family, my in-laws, are Indian, and many of them are practicing Hindus. And when we had babies, those, particularly those that were practicing, would say the Om sound to calm the baby. And their argument for what they were doing was that they were manifesting the universe in doing that. So they felt that was an alignment with meta-reality to calm the baby. And in my experience, it was something that did work. And I'm just bring that final point up, just to make this point again, that much of transcendental critical realism is borrowed from non-Western perspectives. And Roy Bhaskar, this is going into sort of slightly into the minutiae, but it is talked about in a couple of his books. Talks about the difference between karma. So karma being what happens in the day to day. So one thing leads to another. One thing leads to another. Things have causes, have effects. And dharma, though, is God or meta-reality. You might have noticed that we're sort of getting into that realm. In other words, if you're not religious, you might be more comfortable with using the word love, or stick with meta-reality if you want to keep it within a sort of more academic context. And anyway, but we obviously live within a demi-real world, within a karmic world. But there is also this force, this transcendental force, meta-reality. And if we can engage with that, if we can bring that into our lives, if we can live with it, then we experience these ease, peace, harmony, happiness, health, love, and joy. And in fact, I'd go one step further, and I would actually put love. I would personally describe meta-reality as love, as a force rather than as an action. But you can also manifest it through your own actions. So I think I'm getting there. So yeah, so as with those were examples of meta-reality. As with all branches of critical realism, if you are any kind of good practice, so it's written quite a few times throughout Bhaskar's work that all good science and all good social science has always been critical realist. If you're practicing correctly, then it ought to be critical realist anyway, even if you're not saying you're a critical realist. And I want to read this one out, because this is James Baldwin, who's a very famous, an incredible person who was a great leader of the civil rights movements. And this is him, I think, describing meta-reality. This is in a letter that he's writing to his nephew, who is in prison at the height of the civil rights movement. He's in prison for his civil rights work. And this is what James Baldwin advises to his cousin, to his nephew. So I'll just read it out for you. Those innocents who believe that your imprisonment made them safe are losing their grasp on reality. But these men who are your brothers, your lost younger brothers, and if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. We cannot be free until they are free. So he's recognizing that everyone has a meta-real, has a good meta-real self at their core, and that is what we need to find, even in the most toxic of demi-real, literally in what he's describing, master-slave relations. So I'm trying to think so I think I'm just kind of coming to the end here. So to contextualize this into something that we've talked about before, we talked about power at length a few sessions ago, and we talked about how there are two versions of power described within critical realism. So this is very helpful for anyone who has previously been engaging with sort of a Foucauldian type of view of the world, where it's all about power, but it's actually not very distinct exactly what power is. But if we talk about power 2, which is the power over other people, and power 1, which is this more emancipatory power. So it's your so the power 2 is power over people. Power 1 is the ability to be free or to be emancipated. And something that I found that I was reading just the other day that I thought was quite helpful to bring in meta-reality is that Mervyn Hartwig, who's the person who you'll remember wrote the Dictionary of Critical Realism, or edited the Dictionary of Critical Realism, talks about power 0. So this is moving from that demi-real world of master-slave relations, power 1, power 2, and starting to recognize that actually we could describe power in a singular way, but as power as this singular meta-real force. And that force is representative of, as you can see, peace and love, and the actual activity would be care, love, and trust. And I just wanted to bring the bottom right-hand corner here, because I think this, for me, when I talk to people about meta-reality, I think it helps conceptualize it, is we're talking about meta-reality. Sorry, I've written meat reality, apologies, not meat reality, but meta-reality and love and God. So that those are sort of different words essentially for the same thing. And depending on that will be the heresy in what I've just said will depend on your own religious perspective, I guess. So very quickly, so I'm running out of time here. So Priscilla talked us through MELD. So this was so MELD was a sort of schema for your research. MELD R's, by adding on these 3 further stages, is a schema for being, and it's recognizing that you yourself are part of what you do, are part of the research that you're carrying out, and this is you being. So if you remember, going back to my earlier points, meta-reality is when you're not thinking about being, it is when you are. So it's being. That's the key here. So the moment, M is the first moment. So this is when being should be seen as non-identity, that which it is not. So that was the start of your research process. That's the moment. Then we get on to E, which is edge or process. So being is seen as process. At level 3, being seen as or looking at your research in terms of the totality. So considering all of the other external influences on what you're looking at. Finally, so 4 was praxis. So this is where the 4th dimension was where you consider what agency there should be, so what actions there should be in response to your research. But what MELD R's adds is that it finally says that being, so being is reflexive. So we start seeing being as inward and spiritual. So how does what you have learned from your research affect you? What does that mean for you, for yourself? And then R is this proposes that being should be re-enchanted, to be seen as intrinsically meaningful, valuable, and sacred. And finally, being. So this moves us from understanding being to being. So we're not just understanding being, we're being. At this stage, relative reality is eliminated by the unfolding of transcendental consciousness. And I'll just refer you back to that James Baldwin quote. And I think that's a really good example of someone who is at that stage of understanding that there is a deeper truth in the world. There's a deeper goodness that can be seen even in the most awful circumstances. And I'll leave it there. So I'll just leave up the references for a moment. Priscilla, that's me done. I hope I haven't totally confused everyone. But over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. I find meta-reality quite hard, and I was so impressed by this beautiful simplicity, and you've really encouraged me to take it much more seriously. Another thing I like so much about critical realism is it's not just about thinking, but it's about being and doing. And I think also, as we're sort of in the middle of the session, I just want to remind everybody that very sadly, there's a strike next week, and we'll have to delay the final 2 sessions and move them on 2 more weeks, but we will let you know. Now, I'm so thrilled to introduce Gary Hawke. When Roy Basker came to the Institute of Education, he started this course, And when he very sadly died in 2014, there was no one on the proper staff at IOE to take on the course. So Gary was really an inspiration and a great strength, and the course would have just ended without him. So it's great to welcome you back, Gary. Also, another great thing about Gary is that he's not an academic, he is a drama therapist. And that continues what Rob has been talking about, thinking about critical realism in our everyday lives, in our being and doing, as well as in our thinking work. Gary is going to talk about that. Gary interviewed Roy and he has 6 recorded hours, and he's got 4 hours, I believe, on we can see. And then he was going to carry on with Roy as this project, really introducing critical realism to lots of people, including non-academic people who were very interested in the practicalities. But because of Roy's death, Gary had to carry on his own. So he got lots of the discussions transcribed, and he published his book, The Order of Natural Necessity, a kind of introduction to critical realism. And as lots of people say, Roy tended to speak very clearly, but not necessarily always write very clearly. So that Gary's book has captured Roy clarifying his work a great deal. Shall I just hand over to you, Gary, now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Ado?
Shall I see if I can share my screen? Well, let's see if I can do that. Oh, here we go.
And by the way, would people like to be posting questions in the chat? That I went straight on to Gary, Rob, because I couldn't see any questions, but it would be great probably to have questions on both your sessions dealt with together. Thank you, Gary. Do you want to?
Yes, fine.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll go. So, having listened to Rob's presentation, I'm aware that I'm going to cover some of the similar ground, but I think probably this is going to be much more personal, how meta-reality impacts on me, and I guess how in some way I'm seeing meta-reality in my own work. But I'm going to try and walk us to 5A, 6R, 7Z, and then walk away a little bit and see how I use this element of Meltzer in my own work. That's my plan. So I met Roy in 2011 when he was presenting at a midsummer festival that was organized by a spiritual group called Enlighten Next, and it invited a lot of alternative speakers to come and speak about their philosophy or their sociology or their psychology. And Roy was speaking about being an activist for the real. And as Rob's pointed out, Bhaskar believed being an activist for the real was about entering into that non-dual state as an ever-present moment of social integration. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And what I began to realize as Roy was speaking is that he has 2 versions of the transcendental. And I think it's important to point out the shift that happens for Roy when he's going from critical realism into meta-reality. If we think about Transcendental 1, which is a kind of Kantian thing of thinking about or philosophizing about what the world might look like through imagination or philosophy, which is very much about critical realism, basic and dialectical critical realism. It's very much about seeing what the world may be like. In Transcendental 2, there's a change in Bhaskar. He's no longer philosophizing about the world. He's telling us what the world is. He's telling us his own experience. We know that Roy had a number of spiritual experiences in the 90s. And we also know that Roy was beginning to think that he'd said everything he could say about critical realism. He was beginning to move away. And that moving away drew him closer and closer into exploring spiritual domains. So we get this sense of Transcendental 2 being moving or retreating into the depths of reality, and awaken to the re-enchanted nature of the real as non-dual, because Roy had experienced this, he'd had these non-dual moments. It's useful, I think, to situate non-duality, because there is some confusion. This quote from Michael Taft on non-dualism and the brief history of the timeless concept really speaks to the idea that non-dualism is a philosophy and an experience. In the philosophy, we are trying to find words that describe the experience of non-duality in which the subject-object dualities vanish. And Rob pointed this out in Transcendental Identification in Consciousness, that when I am in the moment with something, for example, I see nobody, I just see my screen, but I'm aware that there are 35, 34 people that I am in consciousness with in this very moment. And in this very moment, there is that non-dual space where there is just me speaking. The subject-object dualities collapse. And it's this notion of subject-object collapsing that Roy experienced, that then he came back and began to create the materiality movement. Rob's type, there are 2 books. What we know about these 2 books is that they were written in 4 months. They were a complete outpouring. And Roy points out the reason why there was such an outpouring that meant that these 2 books have appeared very, very quickly for Roy is that most of the heavy lifting is done by From East to West, From Science to Emancipation, and recently, Reality in its Depths. These really give us a sense in how Bhaskar is beginning to think about critical realism in its transcendental dialectical critical realism, which is From East to West. That From Science to Emancipation is a series of lectures that he gave in India, where you can really begin to see Roy sharing how his own spiritual experiences mesh with critical realism, but begin to depart from critical realism. And Reality in its Depths is really Roy, you can, as you read through the book, you can feel Roy grappling with his own experience and the language of his own experience, and in a way moving so far away from critical realism, he's starting to become more a cartographer of his experience rather than a philosopher of his past work. So for me, critical realism and materiality is about addressing irrealism. It's about addressing ontological monovalence, epistemological relativism, and it's about trying to get to that notion that we are separate. And in materiality, Roy calls this the demi-real. And the demi-real, a way of looking at the demi-real is to see it as a Tina formation in which we experience alienation. And what we're alienated from in the Tina formation is that sense of being together, of being a constellation. Everything that happens in realism is built on the notion that there's a real, but we can't access the real. Society refuses to enable that accessing, and therefore we feel some sense of alienation. And in materiality, Roy wants to look at how this alienation happens to individuals. So unlike critical realism, which is about science, materiality is about the person. It's about you and me and how we in some way look towards our own alienation and free ourselves from it. There's a beautiful quote here that comes from Reality in its Depths, and I'll read this out. When Marx said that his vision of a communist society was one in which the free development of each is a condition of the free development of all, he was supposing that we could have a society which would allow the development of individuals as conforming to that formula. So everyone would feel for everyone else. They would respect, they would understand their concrete singular. They would have respect, tolerance, and love for each other. And Roy goes on to say, no society has ever begun to approximate that, but that is the only kind of society which is sustainable. And I will try to show and explain how human freedom is indivisible. For me, this really sits at the heart of what Roy is trying to do with materiality, that we are a concrete singular, that we have an embodied personality that is full of our rhythms and mediations, what we might talk about our karma and our dharma, But then below that, there are the basic actions that all human beings have that constitutes what it means to be human, or to some extent what it constitutes to be sentient. The way in which Roy begins to take this statement and move it into a more nuanced philosophy of materiality is he believes that what we should be doing is working from ego to echo, to ego to eco. It's the sense at which in ego we are separate, and in the sense of eco we are together, we are constellational. And there's a way of thinking about spirituality, if it's a difficult word for us to get hold of, is to think about this eco, this ecological sense, this common sense, this constellational sense, is how spirituality emerges, that we're going from being separate, apart from things, to being part of things. And Roy proposes this because he believes that if we want to get to Marx's structure of society, which we could call it the eudaimonia society, then it has to start with individuals. Transformational model of social activity tells us that we are born into a structure, but we can change that structure, or we can reproduce that structure. Materiality is aiming to enable us to be free of our desires, what Yogacara calls our kleshas, so that what we're able to do is begin to reproduce that society, or transform that society, is a better term, into that eudaimonia society. But we can't just change society, promotes Roy materiality, without changing ourselves. And he suggests the reason why we can begin to change ourselves is a concept is universal solidarity, which is known as principle 1, and axial rationality, which is known as principle 2. Now, I think I've got this right by saying universal solidarity and axial rationality come from dialectical critical realism. But the shift into meta-reality is identity over difference and unity over split. That we have identity, we have a concrete singular, and that concrete singular has an embodied personality, which is our rhythms and mediations. But at that deep level, that meta level, we have identity. We are all the same, axial solidarity. And the unity over split is the reason why we are all the same, is because we all act the same. And because Roy, in that non-dual space of his own spiritual practices, recognizes that, he wants to make meta-reality a philosophy of unity, of freedom. If we go to east to west, we can begin to see how Roy is starting to think about the 5A, 6R, and 7Z. So in east to west, 5A represents aspect, and it's for the sake of euphoria, it's satisfying the spiritual presuppositions of imaginary projects. In my work as a psychotherapist, the emancipatory projects are the clients that I'm working with, and it's incredibly important for me to be able to see the aspect of their need for change as a kind of spiritual thing, that as a constellational thing, and that in working with them together in a kind of therapeutic alliance, we are creating an emancipatory project which aims to enter into a re-enchantment, the 6R, or the realm of re-enchantment. And re-enchantment is, in a simple way, it's that moment when you suddenly, as happened to me recently, I went off to buy some bread, and as I stepped out of the house, it was raining, but there was a beautiful rainbow. I'd prepared for rain, I'd put my coat on, I was thinking I'm going to go and buy bread in the rain. I was completely disenchanted with the idea of buying bread. I walk out of the door and there's this huge rainbow right across the sky, and all of a sudden, all my disenchantment vanishes and I'm in the realm of enchantment. I've been re-enchanted. And it was such a beautiful thing that for a moment I just stood there and experienced it. And that's the 6R realm. And in that moment of being purely there and experiencing it, I awaken to that transcendental unity of consciousness where there's no longer me, there's just rainbow. There's just a moment. Everything drops away from myself. And just at that moment, I'm in that non-dual state. And it's this notion of being able to be in a non-dual state without the idea of meditating and going off to ashrams or retreats and spending thousands of pounds and having a guru. It's that moment of suddenly dropping a way of bread and just being with the rainbow. Rob's pointed to this, but it's useful to point it out again. Once we've identified the notion of being, we can then start thinking about how being is formulated through meta-reality. So we have 5A, which is understanding being as reflective and generally interior. The interior is really important here because this is about looking in on ourselves. It's about going into not the depths of a society or the depths of science. It's about going into the depths of ourselves and discovering more and more of the layers of ourselves. Because in discovering more and more of the layers of ourselves, we then are able to become re-enchanted. So we understand being as re-enchanted. And then at 7Z, we understand being as incorporating the primacy of identity over difference and unity over split, and understanding being as non-duality. For me, then, if I take the melds and what meta-reality brings, I have to think about reflexivity. And reflexivity is the ability of the researcher, or myself, my therapist, to locate themselves in the process of research. If I'm setting up a therapeutic alliance with a client, I'm setting up the therapeutic alliance with the client. That's my research project. But because I've set it up, I'm also part of it. So I got to accept that within the moment of that alliance, I'm also within the alliance. So the other element of reflexivity is to think about the critical awareness of one's own beliefs. What's happening for me in that I may start to dominate that process. I may bully that process along, force that process along because it feels right to me, because it fits in with my own beliefs, rather than thinking of the alliance in and of itself as something that exists, that I am part of. And as a curator, almost in a way, I'm trying to maintain impartiality of what's there by constantly being aware of my beliefs that could get in the way of ensuring the rigorous safe space of that alliance. The other thing to think about, and this is the semiotic triangle, it's about collapsing the semiotic triangle so that we're constantly in some way questioning the intransitive domain. There's a therapeutic process known as clean language, and the job of clean language is to really think about how my client's metaphors in some way get in the way of speaking to the referent, or how the client might speak of the act of somebody else or something else influencing them, rather than beginning to speak about what's happening for them. So this collapsing of going back further and further into that intransitive domain constantly brings us back to the sense in which we always are aware of the ontological moment. And in meta-reality, the deep ontological moment is the non-dual. And then there's also, what am I trying to do when I'm working with clients at another level, is to think about that irreal blind spots that are occluding freedom. Well, I've put this thing about biases and things. I'm uncertain if that's the best way of describing it, but it's to challenge the way in which others see the world, to enable them to see that their world in the demi-real is built on the real, the relative realm, if you will, the realm of buying bread. But the realm of buying bread is built on the beauty of the rainbow for me at that moment. So it's trying to enable all research to get to a way in which we can free ourselves of our blind spots and notice that freedom comes by moving into that deeper and deeper layer of the non-dual. So this is Roy from Meta-Reality. The only alternative to the existing system is the realization and the flourishing of its non-dual basis or grounds. We should be encouraged by the thought that we are already embodied in potential, everything that we need to realize all our dreams. All we have to do is shed or eliminate everything which is inconsistent with that. but never has the target been so clear, never have the lines been so sharply drawn, and never have the stakes been so high, since the very survival of our physical environment is at stake. That's what Roy was doing at that moment. He, for me personally, moved away from critical realism because he believed he'd done everything he wanted to do, looked at the world and said that we're in a bad way. And that if he wanted to be serious, if he wanted his philosophy to be serious, he needed to do something about it, which for him was to give all his money away, was to stop thinking about his self as a human being and start to think about himself as a spiritual being in the non-dual that took on board the idea of ensuring that everybody had some aspect of freedom. And that's me done.
Oh, Gary, thank you very, very much. I was expecting a very beautiful, visually imaginative display from you, because you must spend hours and hours preparing your PowerPoints. And as usual, it was very beautiful. And I love your great examples of the bread and the rainbow. Also, thinking of this time of peace in Ukraine and the absolute puzzle and mystery of how peace could ever be found in the Ukraine and other terrible problems through the world. You're beginning to suggest a way forward for people to build on, aren't you?
Well, if we go further into materiality, when Roy begins to speak about conflict management, he promotes the idea of axial rationality, universal solidarity as the ground state of moving through conflict.
Yes, and your point about ego to eco has resonance for rethinking our place in climate change too, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes. So really, this is critical realism as a way forward to transform society. And of course, as you said, that includes changing ourselves too. And thinking of unity over split, which is so, so difficult to do when we disagree with people and fall out with them, isn't it? So I can see that there's only one sort of question in the chat. Katie, would you like to say your comment or raise it? And would other people like to put up their hands or put things in the chat? You're so welcome to start asking questions. Katie, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Gary, it was I think it was your third slide, and you were saying about sort of like when subjects and objects sort of melt away, and you were saying about when you were speaking to us, that's all that there was in that moment. I think that's what you said, and I just wanted to know, was it like being totally in the moment, you're that concentrated on things, and everything else just simply exists? Sorry if I'm not explaining it very well, it's just what I thought of us on that slide.
No, it's fine. So the thing I might challenge is the notion of concentrating. I think, and I'll do this from my own experience, I don't think it's concentrating so much as allowing oneself the freedom to be in the space. When we think about the notion of, if we think about the idea of anamnesia that Roy speaks about in Materiality, which is that suddenly stopping the sense in which we have to think about things and process things and just let ourselves let go. So concentration drops away, and what we're left with is that internal wisdom. What's the term? The term is practical mystic. We become a practical mystic where we allow things to emerge from ourselves. Because when we allow things to emerge from ourselves, we encounter what is out there as part of ourselves. And as I say that, I realise just how sort of new agey that sounds. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's just hard to get your head around at first. I think I know. I think I'm understanding this a little bit more now. Is it kind of like a state of just being and letting things come out of you without forcing anything to come out? without having to think about it, it just emerges.
Can I give you another example?
Please.
Okay, so I'm going for a run at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I entered into Paternoster Square, and I turned the corner to be confronted by St. Paul's. And at that moment, I did not know where I was. I ceased to be, and there was just St. Paul's. And the vastness of St. Paul's suddenly became the vastness of myself. And it was just unbelievable. And that's what Bhaskar speaking about when he speaks of being in the non-dual. It's being in that space where the vastness of what we see is the vastness of who we are.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to mull it over a little bit more. It's pretty complex. But thank you.
Can I add to that as well? I think that I take that what you just said, Gary, about seeing St. Paul's totally resonates with me, because I had similar experience. I took my kids up a hill yesterday evening. They're quite small. We went up a hill to watch the sunset, and there was a moment where we just were. We weren't watching the sunset anymore. It was a moment of totality, I suppose. But I think as well, I just want to draw it back into, because this is all very new age, as you say, Gary. But I think it's also real. It's also grounded, and it's also so thinking back to those examples of materiality, that they're not all. They're all I think, well, the word phrase I quite like is humdrum. That like we can see it in the humdrum in the everyday, in just the fact of having this conversation. It doesn't have to be this. It's not always awe-inspiring, that collapse. The moment of collapse isn't always. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to be St. Paul's. It can just be in a conversation. It can just be in this conversation that we're having now.
But even now, as you're speaking, my entire sense of being is moving into your entire sense of being, and therefore there's no gap between us.
Yes. No. That's exactly the point I'm making. But it doesn't.
Yeah.
It is every day. It's everyday
Yeah.
It's here all the time, and I think that's what Roy does for me. Is he is talking about these concepts that New Age spiritualists talk about, but he's showing us that we're already there. We're here. It's here. We don't have to, as you say, you don't have to be on a retreat to experience it. You don't.
No, but it's an interesting thing that you pointed that when you're up the hill and you're suddenly that totality in materiality, 3L becomes love.
Yeah. And
that totality of being on the hill is just you experiencing the love of being there.
Yeah.
Another way of it's interesting. A lot of people attracted to critical realism have some kind of faith, great range of different faiths. And Kim has said that she's recalling her Roman Catholic interest. Would you like to say anything, Kim?
Yes, certainly. I'm happy to share. And respecting all other religions as well, and non-faith too. And in a way, I shared a room with Roy, and we had a number of very powerful discussions together. It was towards the end of his life. So I recognize so much, but hearing you, Gary, talk about it, and you, Rob, because when you're in the moment of that reality, it can be quite difficult to ground yourself back down again. But what I have enjoyed tonight is being able to hear you speak about it and actually revisit some of that discussion that I had with Roy, but also I mentioned in the writing some of the things Pope Francis has been putting out about common good, about living with each other, not pushing your religion or your faith, but actually finding that reality of what being human beings together is about. And Roy talked about that quite a bit to me.
Thank you. And also Subi has raised the question of Hinduism, and it would be lovely to hear from you, Subi. Would you like to if Roy is listening to this, he'd be thrilled to hear from you. So would you like to say anything? Subi?
Well, I really enjoyed today's session, and all the things I've been thinking from the beginning, like I came into this presentation of yours not knowing anything about Roy. But all the things I've been thinking about has probably come to a full circle today. And I really enjoyed today's and yesterday, like last week's presentation, because they sort of are like giving the whole, the shape to the wholeness of this idea. And I was always thinking, well, I was also, you know, a 70s music fan. So, you know how all these things connect, you probably understand. I'm not going to talk about it. But so the I cannot explain the idea of Advaitavadism or Advaitavad in Hinduism, but I was always thinking that somehow this had a lot of influence on his thoughts, and today I think I can see it clearly. To understand, it is not possible to understand this concept of Advaitavad in Hinduism in just a few words. You have to like read up about the history of Hinduism from a point back. And so I'm not going to go in there, but this is reflected in the thoughts of the people in the 70s a lot. And this is in direct opposition to the Western or the American introduced idea of individualism, which probably stems from sort of Semitic ideas, where, you know, the humans are the top creation and everything, which stands in direct opposition to the Eastern thoughts of Hinduism, Buddhism, and even I think Shintoism and Taoism and those. And also nowadays I read up a lot and realize that it's also in direct confrontation to the indigenous philosophies of the American continent. And to my understanding, it is like the Western philosophies are thinking that they're discovering new things, which is actually going back to those philosophies that it actually invalidated a long time back. But it's just I can see the full cycle coming together. Thank you very much for today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Subi. And Anya has also mentioned Buddhism. Now, time is getting on rather. Before we go to the breakout rooms, and I won't give you specific questions, I'll just ask you to talk about what Rob and Gary have been saying this evening. But I think we've got a little while to look at, because I keep inviting you to send in your ideas of PowerPoints. And Katie Ormrod at Manchester said that she sent in a fairly simple pair of PowerPoints. Really, it's mainly, Katie, I think, isn't it, to invite people's ideas. So would you like to show your PowerPoint, Katie?
Sure, yeah. Like you said, it is very simple, really. It's only 2 slides. Yeah, I'll start to share it now.
Thank you. Have you got them, Rob? Or
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I'm having a bit of trouble with my computer. It's not great
Right.
at,
I'll share it. Give me 30 seconds.
thank you. Sorry about
No,
this.
that's okay. But would you like to put your visual on, your
Yeah,
video
sure.
on? Thank you. That's great. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Several people have sent in PowerPoints. I do hope we'll have time in the final two sessions to see more of them. Some are quite elaborate and detailed, and some are quite brief and simple, like this one. You're very welcome to send in your PowerPoints. And perhaps, Rob, we can send a reminder tomorrow about the format.
Yeah.
Right, over to you, Katie. Thank you.
Yeah, I've tried to follow the format as best I could, really. Hi, my name's Katie Armrod, and I'm a PhD Year 1 student at Manchester Metropolitan University. And this project is funded by the White Rose Doctoral Training Partnership. So the title of my PhD is to explore the potential of critical global citizenship education in the local community food bank. So the aim of this project is to, well, a little bit about my background. I have worked in this food bank for the past 4 years now as a volunteer, and I've noticed that food banks are very, very associated with food insecurity, poverty, lack, and basically as places of food aid, emergency food aid and charity. So this project sort of hopes to reframe food banks and explore the educational potential of the places, specifically from a critical global learning perspective, which incorporates intergenerational and intercultural learning as well. So the methodology, what I've picked, it's going to be a critical realist ethnography. I'm just saying now as well that it's only in the early stages really, and things may change, but I am picking an ethnography. So I'm guessing some of you will be familiar with ethnography, but basically it's about producing a detailed, deep description of your research setting. But a critical realist ethnography that sort of looks at the structures surrounding that setting and how people interact and are affected by those structures. So the data collection is going to be in 2 phases. Phase 1, that's going to be my main ethnographic observations, where I'm going to be looking at what's going on in the food bank at all levels. Also, I'm going to be putting some interviews in this phase. So at the moment, I'm going to be selecting hopefully 5 volunteers and 5 families who use the food bank. And I'm going to be moving through the whole data collection process with them into phase 2 as well, which is going to be a creative, arts-based participatory method, incorporating video walks, arts-based approaches, that sort of thing. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so how is critical realism going to be applied? So in phase 1 of the project, the ethnographic data and the interviews, that is going to be what is going to inform my next stage. So critical realism will help me to identify the possible mechanisms which are driving the current forms of citizenship, which manifest in the food bank amongst the volunteers and customers. Basically, it's going to ask, how do they see themselves in the community, wider society and globally? So yeah, by finding these mechanisms, well, hoping to find them, I'm hoping to get onto stage 2, which will be the designing of creative arts-based methods, which will then invite the participants to engage in intercultural, intergenerational learning in a critical space. So the critical realism will hopefully help me to find the mechanisms, which is going to help me to design the educational learning activities within the food bank. I hope I'm making sense here and you're still all with me. It's quite complicated. Yeah, so in this space, this is where this is going to be a critical space for mutual learning, mutual dialogues as well. So this can also be emancipatory, I'm hoping, in terms of how people see themselves as citizens. So they may move to seeing themselves in different forms of citizenship, hopefully a critical form of citizenship, which engages with local and global issues. And also it might, maybe people, how they see the volunteering, they may move on to a different way of seeing that, or it could be emancipatory, also in the sense that it can help the food bank to be reframed as a place of critical learning, instead of just a charitable space of food aid. So because I'm using critical global citizenship, which in a nutshell is a form of critical global learning, looking at new ways of understanding and relating to each other, whilst engaging with and challenging injustices, whilst we also must confront our own complicity in the unequal power relations. So because I'm using critical global citizenship education, post-colonial theory is a really important part of this. So in this project, therefore, post-colonial theory and critical realism are going to have to meet. Now, this is going to be quite complex and it is quite undeveloped so far in academia, but I am working on a framework for it, which is going to appear in my thesis, but I'm going to just give you a very small summary of it, where I am so far, and from the existing literature as well. So what excites me about a post-colonial approach to critical realism? Well, lots of things. Because post-colonial critical realism will not only examine the mechanisms what form our reality, but it's also going to look at the colonial mechanisms which are at play and which are shaping the reality that we are in. And from that, we can see how we are still complicit and we are reproducing these colonial influences as well. So as well, De Souza in 2010, in their writing, they also state that because post-colonial theory privileges epistemology, it doesn't actually show the causal mechanisms of imperialism. So a post-colonial approach to critical realism is going to go deeper than that, and it's going to go down to the ontological level. And Tinsley 2021 also writes about this. So the framework what I'm developing at the moment is going to have an ontological base. And that's as far as I am at the moment with it, but it's all going to be in my thesis. So if you're interested at all, then yeah, it'll be in there. So I'm sorry if that was a bit confusing. It's a very complex project, but I hope you got something from it.
This is great, Katie. Thank you so much. And also, maybe if we do continue this Zoom course next year and the year after, maybe you'd like to come back and tell us how you.
Oh yeah, I'd love to.
Another thing is that if anybody's got ideas that they'd like to ask or suggest to Katie, either email her, or else if you can't get hold of her email, would you like to send the email to me and I'll forward it on to Katie. Thank you very, very much. Now, shall we move on now, because it is getting quite late, isn't it, Rob? How should we make a quarter of an hour for the breakouts, do you think, or what do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. Quarter of an hour.
Everybody's so welcome to stay for the breakout who can make the time, and then we'll come back together for just a few minutes after the quarter of an hour. So
okay, I'll sort them out now. Hang on a sec.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to put you in now.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you want to join the rooms, then I'll wander around and come see some of you and make sure everyone's in a room.